8 years ago, Liberty University's then president was preaching in a chapel service, and he talked about the fact that he had a gun in his back pocket, and he told his students they had to get their concealed carry permits. He was criticized, and here was his defense. It just boggles my mind that anybody would be against what Jesus told his disciples in Luke 22:36. He told them if they had to sell their coat to buy a sword, to do it because he knew danger was coming and he wanted them to defend themselves. Jesus, indeed, in our text, in Luke chapter 22, is thinking of danger coming to his disciples. He knows he's about to be arrested and killed. He wants to brace them for this. And he reminds them in the verse before, verse 35, that a year or two earlier when they went out preaching to people, they received hospitality from those they were preaching to. They carried no purse, no knapsack. All they needed, people gave to them. But now, he says, if you have a purse, take it, also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. Now, he says, instead of hospitality, you should expect hostility. They thought by buying a sword, Jesus was saying you better pack some heat to defend yourself. So they showed Jesus, they're already sort of doing that. They produced 2 swords. But sell your cloak to buy a sword was a metaphor Jesus was using for the rough times being ahead. Prepare for opposition. Be ready for the worst. Jesus didn't mean buy a literal sword. He had taught them to love their enemies. Matthew 5, Luke 6. Not to try to wound their enemies, to try to kill their enemies. Part of Luke chapter 6, I tell you who hear me, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. So Jesus encouraging violent self-defense would totally contradict that. And thus, a short time later, Jesus rebuked a disciple who started swinging one of those swords. According to Luke chapter 18, it was Peter. He says, verse 51, no more of this. Jesus was not wanting swords for self-defense. And in the parallel account in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus follows up his put away your sword with a categorical statement against all use of swords. He says, all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Plus, another indication Jesus did not mean a literal sword is when you look at how the disciples responded to persecution in the book of Acts. Acts shows a church armed only with prayer and faith in God. The early church expected and endured persecution without armed resistance, but with joyful suffering. These are some of John Piper's words. They were so freed from the love of this world and so satisfied with the hope of glory, the supreme value of their treasure in heaven, that they could do this. So clearly the disciples later realized that Jesus didn't mean the sword comment literally. Jesus didn't mean for them to think in terms of armed defense the rest of their ministry. So instead of packing heat or commending that in the New Testament, they commend Jesus' example For instance, 1 Peter 2, starting verse 21, Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. In the next chapter, verse 9, Peter says, do not repay evil with evil or insult with evil. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called. So this is Peter. Peter caught it. We don't know, hopefully, by the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit came on him, he knew, whatever. So that's our text. I'm doing a series of sermons on reasons I delight to follow Jesus. And one of those reasons for me is just my amazement that Jesus and his call to show grace and mercy to our enemies just shows me how wise he is. And I want to follow someone who is this wise. Many people are sure that Jesus is foolish in this teaching. James Watson, the one who, along with Francis Crick, won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of DNA, later in his life, he called "love your enemy" as one of the stupidest sentences in the English language. It can seem ridiculous if you think about it. Us loving our enemies, doesn't that encourage them to just take advantage of us? And it sure is totally counterintuitive. I mean, it's totally against our instinct. When somebody hurts us, disrespects us, gives us a black eye, it seems like we should give them a black eye so they know what it feels like and so they won't do it again. But Jesus says, love them, do good to them. When mistreated, you don't try to get even, you rather respond with love. And it's because of the wholeness and the health that flows from this way. Loving our enemies is wise. I want us to just quickly look at what happens when we meet a bully the way that we naturally want to, which is meet them with threats or violence. Let's assume that we are stronger than that bully, that we have a bigger stick to wave. Can that change the bully's behavior? And the answer is yes. They can make them afraid to wrong us anymore. So there is some good in force, in threatening someone with a sword. Force might make bullies stop their behavior. But how does that work in the long run? How does it work the next day, the next month? Are we sure that we will remain the stronger one? Because that could change. We would have good reason to be anxious whether or not we actually can remain stronger. A fun way to see this is Dr. Seuss's The Butter Battle book. I don't know how many of you have enjoyed, you've all enjoyed Dr. Seuss, I'm sure. In this one, all the Zooks eat their bread with the butter side down, and all the Ukes eat with the butter side up. And the grandpa Uke tells his son as he grits his teeth, you can't trust a Zook who spreads bread underneath. Every Zook must be watched. He has kinks in his soul. So Grandpa joined the Zook watching border patrol. If any Zook dared come close, I could give him a twitch with my tough, tufted, prickly snickberry switch. But how did those Zooks feel about that? When we use force on someone, do they like that? Or do they sort of resent that? Do they think of how they can stop us? Well, one day, a very rude Zook by the name of Van Itch snuck up and slingshotted my snickberry switch. So the Ukes no longer had the upper hand. So the chief Yukaru ordered the boys in the back room to figure how to build me some sort of triple sling jigger. Now, with my hand on the trigger, Van Itch looked quite sickly. He ran off quite quickly. So, it's over. It's solved, right? Well, the Zook came back the next day with a jigger rock snatch'em, which flings rocks back just as quick as they catch 'em. So now what? Well, the chief Yukaru and his boys in the back room have to think up a better gun. They certainly did. They thought up a gun called the Kickapoo Kid, and they carefully trained a real smart dog named Daniel to serve as our country's first gun-toting spaniel. Did that solve things? No, the Zook's boys in the back room responded with the 8-nozzled, elephant-toted boom blitz. It shoots high explosive sour cherry stone pits. Poor Daniel and I were scared out of our wits. And of course, the arms race continued. You get the idea. So force might work, maybe, if you really are stronger, for a time, but generally things get worse. Thus, Jesus said, those who take the sword perish by the sword. Force can change a bully's behavior, but not change them on the inside. If anything, it makes them worse on the inside. They resent you. They're more set against you, wanting to look for ways that they can harm you. Force is too weak to change a bully's heart or his attitude. On the other hand, what about Jesus' way, that counterintuitive way? When we as followers of Jesus, when we seek the bully's good, when we seize the initiative with an act of love. Let me tell you a story. Every evening, 31-year-old Julio Diaz in New York City would end his subway ride home one stop early so he could eat at his favorite diner. But one night, as Julio stepped off the train and onto the platform, a teenage boy pulled out a knife and demanded his money. Julio gave him his wallet, saying, "Here you go." As the teen began to walk away, Julio said to him, "Hey, wait a minute. You forgot something. If you're going to be robbing people for the rest of the night, you might as well take my coat to keep you warm." And that was not human goodness coming out. That was seeds Jesus sowed coming out. There's a strong echo of what Jesus said in Matthew 5 there. The robber looked at him like, "What's going on here?" and said, "Why are you doing this?" Julio said, "If you're willing to risk your freedom for a few dollars, then I guess you must really need the money. I mean, all I wanted to do was to get dinner, and if you really want to join me, hey, you'd be more than welcome." Julio says Julio says he and the teen went into the diner and sat in a booth. The manager comes by, the dishwashers come by, the waiters come by to say hi. And Julio says, the kid was like, "You know everybody here? Do you own this place?" "No," Julio told him, "I just eat here a lot." "But you're even nice to the dishwasher." "Well, haven't they taught you should be nice to everybody?" "Yeah, but I didn't think people actually behaved that way." Julio asked him what he wanted out of life. The young guy just had a sad face, couldn't answer. When the bill arrived, Julio told the teen, "Look, I guess you're going to have to pay for this because you got my wallet. Or if you give my wallet back, I'll gladly treat you." He says the teen didn't even think about it, just returned the wallet. Julio paid for the meal. Then he gave the teen $20 and he asked him for something in return. The teen's knife. And the teen gave it to him. Jesus calls us to respond to someone who mistreats us with generous love, because love is strong enough to transform the evildoers, to change their heart, to change what they freely choose to do. Jesus' way can make a bully want to do good. Can. How often does it? How often does that good scenario happen? What are the odds? Wouldn't it be nice if we could run some sort of experiment to show in some lab which response actually works best, the sword or the self-giving, suffering love? Introducing game theory. I shared this with some of our teens here a couple years back. One way to research things like this is to come up with games that mimic real-life situations and then play them multiple times in the lab, analyze which responses work best in the long term, which don't. And a respected university lab actually did this. A whole lot of students played 8,000 rounds of a game that distills the dynamics and choices we face every day as we interact with others who might hurt us, who might be nice to us. Each round involved two players. A player could choose cooperate with the other, be trusting and loyal, basically giving of their dimes, hoping that the other will also give of theirs. Or they could choose defect, not be loyal to the other, but make sure they themselves gain a dime, even if it means the other loses a dime. So each make their choice, they find out the other's choice, but they also had a third option. The players would typically play another round with the person they just had played. There was a 75% chance that there would be a second round or a further round. And if somebody was mad at how the other treated them the previous round, or maybe rounds, they could also choose punish. They would pay a dime, so the other had to lose 4 dimes. So, 8,000 rounds. Which ones work best? Here was the USA Today headline describing the results. Nice guys actually finish first. And here's an extended quote from the article. The players who punished their opponents the least, or not at all, made the most money. Those who punished the most made the least money. When faced with a nasty opponent, turning the other cheek, where does that phrase come from? And continuing to cooperate paid off more in the long run. Now, some of you are still skeptical, not really letting this fully soak in because you think, but some evil actors, if they know they're not going to be resisted by force, will make life a horror for others. Just, hallelujah, God takes care of that. Romans chapter 13 says God established police, calls them servants of God, so that evil people can't freely harm others without being punished. Also, God established what we know as the final judgment. Evil is going to be punished. The world needs that, and the world needs the message of Jesus, that God loves us even when we do wrong. We need to hear that to draw us to change. That love helps to transform us when we are God's enemies. And the world needs us who follow Jesus to inject grace and mercy into the world, taking the risk of loving enemies, lifting the world from being stuck in an eye for eye, tooth for tooth, with the whole world in danger of going blind and toothless. But far too often, we err on the side of too much force. Someone with a doctorate in international relations and political theory from Harvard wrote that probably 99% of the time, governments err on the side of too much violence. And in our personal life, we have the same tendency. We love our enemies far too infrequently. Because love is indeed a risk. Every time we love our enemies, there's a good chance that we could end up with it being suffering love. But love ups the odds of good happening in that situation instead of the spiral of retaliation. Force just adds to the number of alienated, angry, lonely people in the world. But love has the power to turn enemies into friends. One last bit of counsel. Don't give grace and mercy because you see good coming from it. Because often, we can't see that good. Do that because it's the way of Jesus. And we are followers of Jesus. And we will see the good because there's no one wiser than Jesus.